Well, thank you all for joining me this afternoon, this morning, whatever time zone it happens to be. I am talking about a topic that is so far-ranging and so complex, but on the other hand, it's simple and it sort of bounces back and forth. I had to ask what WorkingX meant and what is this X? And it was all about the employee experience. And when I started thinking about employee experience, to me, it became this wonderfully rich equation of a lot of variables being pulled together. And we'll talk about those as we go along. I do think that the one constant in the equation is communication, and that's where I've spent most of my life. But there are other factors too. It's everything from culture that we talked about in the panel session earlier on. It's manager communications and effectiveness. It's senior leadership. It's that employee advocacy programs. It's sort of everything mixed together. And so it's hard to define and hard to fathom. And I always think of the X as something that we ran into in school. And some of us were more comfortable with those classes than others. That whole math side of things. And, the beginning math was pretty simple. And then you had to run into algebra and they would throw things at you like solve for X, where, 2x plus 10 equals 7x. And you learned how to solve something like that, which is a relatively simple math problem, algebraic problem, because the answer is 2. 2 times 2 is 4, plus 10 is 14, which is 7. But then they started throwing things at you like this, which is x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. And for those of you who remember a little bit from algebra, it's actually got 2 answers because it's a curve. And so you have 2 as one of the answers, but also a minus 3. And then you went to another higher level of math and you have this function of 2x to the distributive equals x squared plus c. And that's about the time I tuned out of all of that sort of stuff, because I think what we need to do is focus on finding a way to use numbers, because I think it's critical that we prove what it is that we're doing and be able to measure all of this sort of fun stuff. But it's also to build a communications equation that is attuned to our organization, where they are today, what we're trying to accomplish, where we're going with all this. And it's hard to sit here and say, this is the answer, because I don't think there is one answer. It's as complex as math in many, many ways. So what I want to do is really talk about some of these variables that go into how you might build your program and fine tune it to where your audience is. I think it's mostly employees, but it could be a lot of others. And also how you can control the variables. Where is it going? And what are some of the trends that are so important in sort of managing an employee communications program that directly affects things like the employee experience as measured by engagement scores. So let's talk a little bit about some of these things. So first is mobile first. If you're not figuring out how to include something that takes account of the fact that most people are getting most of their information about the world around them, certainly in staying in touch with friends around the world, but even coworkers, you've got to start thinking mobile first. Very few people are tied to their larger screens. And then you do have people for whom they are never at their work site on their desktop. They are on the shop floor in manufacturing facility. They are on the sales floor in a retail establishment. They are driving groups of people somewhere, whether you're an Uber driver or you're a FedEx delivery person. And I think one of the things that struck me one time when I went to a session at a great communications conference was the people who are beginning to design things for mobile first. Because historically, is designed this thing that looks great on the screen, on the laptop, and whether it's our intranet page or whether it's our platform where we're putting news up there, it looks great on the big screen, but when you start to shrink it, it doesn't behave as well. And the smartest thing I heard was from someone was working at McDonald's. And McDonald's realized that a lot of the people that work in their restaurants are, employees who are, mobile only. They don't have access to. And so by designing it for that and then scaling it up, instead of trying to take something big and scale it down and losing it, thought made so much more sense to me. So if you're not doing mobile first, think that way, find some way to incorporate that in your program, because it is, if not the predominant way that people are getting their information, it certainly will be. And I think we deal with then, there's this whole thing of do people have access to this while they're doing this during their working hours, or should we ask them to do this in their off hours? And my personal belief is that we are seeing a major blend back and forth anyway. People are not productive only between this hour and that hour. Clearly, you don't want a train driver accessing this while they're driving the train, or a truck driver, but at the same time, employees have a personal life even when they're at work. So I may have to do some sort of banking transaction during the hours that the bank is open, and or that I need to do things. So think of the mobile first aspect to things, and be a little bit more lenient, and realize people do things beyond the 8 to 5 hours. So beyond that, I think we also need to think about video. And video is short video. So maybe TikTok is the model, as opposed to doing the 1.5 hour town hall meeting that you then record and post for people to watch later. You're lucky if you get people to watch it the first time. The idea of going back and rewatching a long thing is insane. And there are ways to take long video and compress it. I saw a brilliant model used by one large employer where they took a session that was led by the CEO, and the CEO was just questions and answers. Whatever it is that's on your mind, I want to answer. But instead of sort of saying, here's this hour-long session, and the one that you want to see is at the 42-minute mark, and having people zoom through this thing to find the right spot, they broke it up into a series of 23-minute videos. And then they posted those, and there was an index that let you get to it, so you could find the question that was of interest to you and the answer, and not have to watch the other 57 minutes of stuff. So think video, because I think the other piece is that more people are getting more information that way, and it has tremendous impact. It's a lot more credible, and it has that immediacy. I think the other piece that I would encourage everyone to think about is not necessarily putting all that poise and polish and studio stuff into their employee communications. Yes, every once in a while it makes sense, but we've learned in this last couple of years of pandemic to accept people who are broadcasting from home and their own little TV studios that they've built. But if it looks as if somebody's working off of a teleprompter, if it looks got too much poise and polish, if it looks like it took a long time to produce it, people are going to find that as a bit of a turnoff. So shorter, more powerful, more impact, and directly from the source. Source could be the senior most leader, but it could be really anybody across the organization. One of the most impactful things that I have seen, it sort of ties in with another topic, but it does not have to be coming from corporate communications for it to be effective. I think one of the things that we need to see more of is user-generated content, and the ability for people to be able to post what it is that they want to be able to see. One of my favorites is a company that was focused really on doing some safety communications. And instead of having the corporate people go off and create a whole series of, here's how to have safety on the work site, what they did was they had a little bit of a competition, a contest, if you will, and asked people on the front lines to record a safety message about something that they were doing right, or a near miss, or a lesson they'd learned about safety. And it was so impactful. This was a construction company, hearing from the people who were at job sites as opposed to some slick, cool, polished production. And it also increased the number of people who were involved in the content. It also makes life a little bit easier, I think, for communications people, because we never have the time or the bandwidth to be doing everything from everywhere. And we need to find ways to encourage others to be able to do this. And it doesn't really have to necessarily be, from corporate communications for it to be effective. In fact, sometimes it might be just the opposite. So a lot of user-generated content. I also think that one of the things we need to do, and do a much better job of, is manager communications. I did a study many years ago, and there are a lot of people who sort of read that and followed it and think, oh, Brad, you are a huge fan of manager communications. And I am. But I also think that we need to stop thinking of managers as a communications channel. One of the ways that we tried to do that not that long ago was give managers a meeting in a box, which was we would prepare all the materials and sort of dump it on them and expect them to deliver it to their employees. Well, one factor is that people now can get stuff directly. That stuff doesn't necessarily need to come from my immediate manager. Number two, we got the bandwidth to deliver all this stuff. We need to teach managers a new form of communications for them to be effective. And that's, again, where employee communications people may not be able to do this, but maybe it's part of manager training, it's HR, it's that professional development program that you've got, maybe even it's outside. What this new communications role for the manager is not necessarily imparting information about the performance of the company or the change in the benefits or what the vision is for the company. It's to have a dialogue with employees to be able to interpret what's going on in the world around them and make it relevant to them. So sort of that what's in it for me, sort of what's in it for us collectively for the working group is the new role of the manager. And so it's much less the one way, let me tell you about what's going on. It's more of the dialogue that needs to take place, because matching it up with the here's what it is that we're trying to accomplish at the highest level, here's what it is that we're doing. Let's talk about how your job impacts sort of the team and the larger organization. And I think for the longest time, we've ignored training managers on how to be effective communications people in general. And I think that we have to really hone in on this skill set of it's a dialogue. It's not the me telling you, me directing. It's me understanding where you're coming from. And that gets back to some of the things that you heard in the very, very opening panel about sort of that servant leader as a manager. And I think it's that new skill set for the new manager if they really want to, one, hold on to employees for as long as they possibly can. It's also the effectiveness of getting that employee that reports to you ready for that next challenge that comes in their career. Now, ideally, again, you'd like to have that within your own team, but your job as a manager is to get ready to promote people. So manager communications, I think, is a new thing that we're going to have to focus on. The next thing is, I think information has to be shareable. And you've heard a little bit about that with the employee advocacy, and there are other sessions, and I hope you attend one of them. I think in sharing it, it's both sharing it internally, but also playing that role and sharing it with the social networks. There was a great book back in the 1990s, that last century stuff, about the Clue Train Manifesto, which said that there is much more credibility in the conversation if it comes from those people on the front line. Our frontline workers are the ones who probably have more impact in the marketplace, the people who can reach the potential buyers, users of our services with more impact than the marketing department does. That conversation that you can have is very, very valuable with that audience out there. And there's nobody better than the few hundred, the few thousand, the 10,000 employees out there. They have a much bigger megaphone than what corporate can ever buy through advertising or paid placement. So find ways to make the content that you have shareable. Now, that said, it varies tremendously from industry to industry. If you're in healthcare, there are lots of reasons. In the US, we call it HIPAA rules that don't allow you, there's privacy about your medical information. It just can't be shared, even in sort of a abstract vision. Banking is a little bit more regulated around the world and is not the kind of place where some things that happen internally you share externally. But there are so many opportunities to be able to tell some great stories that, one, should be shared with all employees so that they understand the culture, but also shared externally. And I will say that this shareable information is also probably one of the best recruiting tools that an organization has. It's the way that people have an insight into what your organization is all about. If you can tell some of the stories that are going on inside your organization to the outside world, one, it makes you as an organization seem much more approachable, much more human. You are the kinds of people that I want to do business with. And it gives prospective employees this, wow, that's the kind of place that I'd like to work. So give your employees that license to be able to share information about what's going on in the organization within parameters. So like no financial disclosures and a few other things. Figure out what is shareable and what isn't. But I would say that in general, we're not doing enough sharing. And I would also share one more great story that I just loved that gives you the impact. I think sometimes we also need to find ways to break down these barriers between that's external and this is internal, and never the two worlds shall meet. Being able to share things that are mostly focused on the internal side, outside, it gives you tremendous impact, and vice versa. My friends at Genentech down the road in South San Francisco, for employees would regularly, and they're the ones who do a lot of amazing genetic pharmaceutical activities. And they would, for example, bring in cancer patients who have gone through treatment with Genentech product to be able to talk to the employees. And those are some amazing stories about how if it had not been for the stuff that you're producing, I wouldn't be here today kind of stories. They're doing that for employees, which is an amazing thing. But then they also take that video and find ways to share it and let their employees share it. Because one is, it gives you a tremendous sense of pride that the work that you do is having an impact around the world. And it's that individual impact when you hear from someone who's a survivor. So those stories, when shared externally by people who are working on the product, give you that much more sort of pride in what the organization is all about. And we were talking about people who leave companies and leave managers, but one of the reasons why people stick is because they do feel as if what they're doing makes a big difference. So find ways to sort of package this stuff so that it can be shareable. I also think that we need to do things that are memorable. And by memorable, I usually mean cutting out a lot of the corporate crap that most of us are forced to write at some time, where if you write something, it's like you get to the third paragraph before you figure out what they're really talking about, because it's got all sorts of weird corporate blah, blah, blah up at the front end. We need to find ways to bring that creativity that so many of us have into our work and make it stick. So how can you be concise and short and memorable and find ways to not contribute to the white noise, but break through the white noise? And I think that's one of the things that communications people can take great pride in, is their ability to be able to say, what if we did this way, and come up with some new way to say things. So find ways to do it. And memorable doesn't necessarily need to be the slickest video. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the most clever writing and headlines. It can be just a major impact. I'm reminded a little bit of a great presentation made by the head of the American Medical Association, where he took off on something that appeared in a movie. Somebody will remember for me and put it in the chat. The Christmas movie, Love Always, Love Everything. And remember, there's one scene where the guy who's trying to date somebody comes and holds up little cue cards. The head of AMA during COVID had a mask on, the door opens, and he's holding these things up. It's about a 2-minute video, extraordinarily impactful, mostly for employee audiences, but then it was shared externally. Memorable, creative, got all sorts of rave reviews, and people loved it. So find ways to break through the clutter so that you can reach the audiences that you need to reach. And then most important, even though I put it at the bottom of the list, but sort of tying all these things together, is measurable. I spend a lot of time evaluating communications competitions, awards programs, and looking at entries of great work from around the world. The ones that are the best in class tend to be the ones that have a very, very high impact on the business side of things. And yes, they're creative and they're beautifully executed and all that. But the closer you can tie your work to some sort of goal of the organization, the better off you are. And we have built into Haiilo products lots of measurement tools that are extraordinarily helpful, because you need to be measuring everything. When it comes to this, what is the employee experience? How do you know whether you're effective? What is employee engagement? What are the numbers? The answer is going to be it's different for every single one of us. I will say it's not just necessarily the clicks of the people who looked at things. There are also some longer term metrics that you need to look at. So for example, if employee engagement, part of what you're trying to accomplish is lower the Great Resignation, the turnover rate, the number of people leaving the organization, how do you measure that? And that's not just necessarily by how many people read this great thing that I wrote or watched that marvelous video. You're looking at other factors too. What is the actual turnover rate in terms of the percentage of people leaving? What are the Glassdoor ratings for our organization looking like? There's usually in most employee surveys some sort of a question of I'm proud to talk to others about the place where I work, or mention this as a great place to work. Those are kinds of metrics that we need to take into account and do. And all of our work, to some degree, needs to be measurable and measure not just necessarily the output, but the outcomes of what it is that you're doing. So all of this stuff is measuring. I guess the one constant that you sort of heard me talk about is creative communication. It doesn't necessarily have to do with just cranking stuff out and checking the box and saying, I did it. It needs to be the kind of stuff that has an impact. So I should be quiet for a second. And, Kirsten, I think I've seen chat has been active, or there's some questions coming in, but do you want to break in and let me know what it is that people are interested in hearing?
I'd love to. All right, so we just received the first question, actually, and I am just going to read it out to you. It says that I really love the idea and theory, putting people first, communicating through your employees. The example of a pharmaceutical company was really powerful. I love the idea of making employees see the results of their work. But as we know, in most cases, the senior level wants to see the numbers, and they usually want to see it immediately prior to changing the comms strategy. Is this people first approach to culture and comms just a utopia, or is it an achievable reality?
I think it's achievable. However, the tough part is we have to educate senior leaders as well. I think they're too often focused on cause and effect relationships. It's like, we did this and this was the outcome. And I think the pushback that I've always made with senior most leaders is that some of these things are measured over time, and it's a longitudinal study, and you don't really necessarily have to do just a before and after. I mean, I can go in and do a survey before I introduce a product, communications effort, a campaign, and see what the outcome is afterwards, and one hopes that the numbers go up. But the real question is, do they stay up? Do they drop? Do they plateau? What's going on? So you need to do both. You need to be able to measure the short-term effects of your communications program and the longer term effects. And it also ties into this one topic that I had, which is this isn't something that communications people need to do all by themselves either. I've taken a few stat classes and numbers and all that, but I by no means am an expert in this. One of the best people that I befriended one time was the person who does the analysis of the employee surveys. And I would always come with questions to ask them. It's like you get these reports back, and I'm always like the curious person asking the second and the third level question. And they're the ones who know SAS intimately and can go in and start, manipulating the data and doing all sorts of regression analysis that I know the term, but I don't know how to do it. When I did my MBA program, my finance professor said, you need to learn the phrase empirically discriminates more so than, so you can drop that into casual conversation and make it sound like you know what you're talking about. So find these people in the organization and realize that what we're doing in communications is creating the communications environment, some of the tools, some of the platforms, the training people how to do it, trying to make everybody in the organization a better communications expert, whether it's that senior most leader that you need to do, it's the HR people, it's the training and development people, it's the people in charge of marketing, to be able to tell all these stories. And we're not in this alone. So are there other questions? We probably have a small enough audience. If you want to unmute and just sort of yak at me, we can do that too.
Yeah, maybe I can quickly comment.
Sure.
As a marketer, many of these things really resonate because it's so kind of applicable in a marketing context, but we just tend to forget these things when it comes to internal kind of communication. And these are exactly topics that we've been discussing kind of internally, like how can we actually get better in bringing everybody on board by having a good kind of level of understanding what different teams are doing. And like you said, not necessarily kind of explaining what are the outputs, but what are the actual outcomes, and how everybody in the team can actually be a great communicator and be enabled to share kind of within our kind of own organization. So that's something really resonates with me. Maybe what I would add is that at least we see from our side and from my own kind of experience for working in a very large corporation, is that as a kind of communicator, it's also very important that you're the one who's picking the most important pieces of information, and then, like you said, package it in a memorable way, and so that it actually sticks, but kind of helping people to get out of all the noise that is happening around you, so that they can actually kind of remember the most important pieces.
In fact, many of my colleagues talk about being those sort of curators, the ones who are scanning, who have the connections all across, and being able to amplify and see these great stories, repackaging it in such a way, maybe pointing to the original source material. And I think you're right. The larger the organization, the more easy it is to see silos form and not cross. In fact, Jan answered a question about silos in organizations too. I think one of the things that we often do is design our communications plans and structures to mimic the org chart. And then when the organization changes, we have to go and redesign this, that, and the other. We need to find ways to look at the little more holistic ways that employees network across an organization. And there are tools now that allow you to define audiences, let people subscribe to information. So a perfect example, if you are the business partner in HR who happens to be calling on finance, you might not be plugged into what the communication is in finance unless you're able to break down that silo and get on those distribution lists and subscribe to the information, take part in the conversations that are going on over in finance so that you're more effective in your role over here. Now, your colleague who sits right next to you may be calling on IT. Well, they need to have a network that looks a lot different than yours. So what I keep saying oftentimes is that communications people shouldn't be the ones who decide how this sort of stuff is packaged and structured. Ultimately, we need to move from a sender-centric communications model to a receiver-centric model where you as the reader, you as the viewer decide what information you need to be able to do your job most effectively, and recognize that we as communications people don't have that insight because we can't be in the minds of 20,000 people around the globe. So we need to just make sure that the system works and that people are producing the information that's useful. So maybe that salesperson in that part of the world communicates directly with that person, even though they might be in different reporting spheres. So our job is to help break down those barriers with the help of the other people in our organization. That's one of those trends. Have we exhausted our time?
I think we have. I was going to say.
Over there.
Yeah, I think we need to. Thank you so much, Brad, for these interesting insights, tips, and ideas. I actually noted down one for myself. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for participating, also actively participating. I know that makes sessions like this just that much more fun. It has been a pleasure having you. And I'm going to post the link to the broadcast portal in the chat now. So you can go back there to reunite with Max Hunter and enjoy the pub quiz that's coming up, and hopefully see a lot of you there.
Thanks. And if you need to reach me, I'm pretty easy to find. So send me a note with other questions. I'd love to follow up.
Awesome.
Have a great rest of your day.